Hello everybody, it's Dr. Aric here, and I'm with my good friend Dr. Mario. Everywhere we look, Facebook, Twitter, blogs, there's studies describing health benefits, but how do we know what to believe? In this video, we're going to provide you with the tools necessary to critically appraise some of that health advice you find on the internet. Ketogenic diets, you name it, there are strong claims in some of these posts, but it takes a critical eye sometimes to come up with a common sense decision.
So one of the goals in all of these videos is essentially to give you guys the tools on how to do some of this stuff. We want you to be skeptical consumers. Through traditional media like TV, radio, newspapers, these are not tremendous sources of information for you because often they're going for things that are of interest, that'll catch your eye, while not actually being necessarily reliable or high quality. What we want to do is give you guys, again, the tools on how to sift through this stuff. Often you'll get your best information, ironically, from Twitter and Facebook from health professionals and people that you trust who you know will be giving you high quality information.
As the general public, you're probably looking for sources of information to either confirm or potentially modify your health behaviors to improve health. But there's so much information out there. It's really important to look for specific things that can help you make more informed decisions. Off to Dr. Mario for some advice.
So we're going to give you 4 things to look for when you're evaluating studies or trials that you see either on the internet or in other media. Again, there are more than 4, but we're just going to give you the top 4 to look at. Human trials, randomized controlled trials, large numbers of subjects, and firm clinical endpoints.
So if you look at certain health claims, certain ones tend to ebb and flow over time. One year it's a good thing to do, the other year it's a bad thing to do. One example is whole egg consumption. Sometimes it's recommended as a good thing, others not so much, and it's because people are overvaluing poor trials.
So we're going to review each of the 4 points in detail. So first, the necessity for human trials. So if we're going to make recommendations or treatment recommendations to patients, it needs to be based on actual human clinical trials. And why is that so important? The scientific literature is littered with things that seem promising in a lab bench model or a mouse model, but when it came to actually human trials, it just didn't pan out because humans are complex. We have complex physiology, complex behavior, and it's so important to actually get that human trial before we change our behaviors.
And you'll see this a lot in the supplement industry when it comes to fitness, where one type of substance is trialed on a few rats in a lab, published in a small journal, and all of a sudden it's on the shelf. It's because these products are not regulated and it's very easy to make claims based on weak data. So point number 2 is to have an adequate sample size. It's one thing to have a single small study on a couple of subjects published in a small journal, but it's another thing to have a high-powered study in humans that looks at hundreds, if not thousands of people that can come to more high-powered results. There's a big difference between those 2 types of papers.
Now, studies done on a small number of subjects can be useful, generating hypotheses for bigger trials, but not using those small studies to actually change our treatments and actually change how we're going about treating patients. So point number 3, having firm clinical outcomes in these studies. So what's a firm clinical outcome? Well, something like, did the patient live or die? Or did they have a heart attack, a stroke, a hospitalization, or even something like pain, which seems subjective, but at least, again, it's a measurable outcome that matters to the patient. What's an example of a less clinical outcome? Well, something like a surrogate outcome. So what's a surrogate marker? Let's say you're putting a patient on a new cancer drug and it affects some inflammatory blood test. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that the patient's going to improve clinically, yet a lot of studies are done looking at these surrogate markers. So when you're evaluating a study, you want to look at are they actually measuring and would that actually be meaningful to the patient?
Tip number 4 is hopefully making sure that the study has a control group. And even better, that it's randomized. Why? Well, I saw a point of advice on the internet the other day using one study on 10 subjects that didn't have a control group. How do you know that that intervention actually worked?
So why are these 4 principles so important? Well, we know that if we don't follow these principles, we can be led astray into believing that studies that were either preclinical or didn't have big sample sizes can tell us things that aren't actually true when we do them on a bigger scale. So I'm going to give you 2 examples in medicine where doctors have been led astray by not following these principles. So the first example we'll give is the link between B vitamins and cardiovascular disease. We've known for a number of years that a molecule called homocysteine is elevated in patients with cardiovascular disease, and this is a fairly strong link that's been agreed upon for a number of years. So the thought has been, well, if homocysteine levels are high in people with cardiovascular disease, why not do things to lower it, and could we prevent cardiovascular disease? And we know that B vitamins do tend to decrease homocysteine levels. So in lab studies, they've drawn up mechanisms that seem to make sense, and even in some animal models, they've treated animals with B vitamins and it tended to decrease cardiovascular disease. But lo and behold, when they actually did large-scale clinical trials, it was found not to have worked. So 3 studies that we're going to tell you about that showed that this actually wasn't the case. So the NORVIT, the HOPE-2, and the VISP trial, which will give you the links for all 3 of those trials, big trials done about 10 years ago, all showed no benefit to B vitamins for treating cardiovascular disease. So again, this is something that seemed to make sense for a number of years that, yeah, this was probably going to pan out. And lo and behold, when they actually did proper studies, it didn't pan out, which is why we need to follow these principles.
Linking it back to the previous point, back to over-the-counter supplements. If the claim of a supplement on the bottle is based on a single study without a control group that's not randomized and potentially not even in humans, how do you know it actually works?
And the second example we'll give where people can be led astray with not good quality trials is in the area of anti-amyloid treatments and Alzheimer's. So there's been a fairly clear link for a number of years between amyloid deposits in the brain and risk of developing Alzheimer's. And again, this is another fairly tight link that we've seen between the two. So it only made sense that if we can target therapies to decrease amyloid, we would probably decrease the risk of Alzheimer's. And again, this was borne out in lab studies, in animal models, and even in some lower quality human trials where it seemed to actually improve cognitive function. But again, bigger studies that are done, which we're going to link to just below here, in anti-amyloid antibodies that were done. And these were big trials in the New England Journal of Medicine, which showed no benefit to them. And again, these were pharmaceutical-driven trials, right, costing millions of dollars. That didn't pan out. And a little aside, when people claim that the pharmaceutical company is pulling the strings on every trial and making every trial positive, here's a perfect example, because this would have been a blockbuster. This would have been a $1 billion market for this drug, and trials were done and it showed not to work. Again, this is something that seemed to make sense, something seemed that, everything leading up to this seemed like it was gonna work, but high quality human trials, large studies, randomization showed why it's so important to actually tease out what works and what doesn't work.
So ironically, at a time when big pharma conspiracy theories are all over the internet, it was actually the transparency of a big pharma sponsored paper that led to disproving a potential lucrative investigation for Alzheimer's disease.
So to review the 4 things you want to look for when you're evaluating a study or a trial or a news story that you see: number 1, human trials; number 2, did it have a large number of subjects; number 3, did it use firm clinical endpoints; and number 4, was it a randomized control trial?
And equally important is not only should we hold these clinical trials to a high standard of care, I think it's important for all of us to hold our own health decision-making to a high standard of care. You may not want to change how you eat or exercise or what medications you take based on a small study shared by a blog on the internet. Hold yourself to a high standard of care and ask for good data and good science when it comes to the decisions and what you put into your body. So if you use any other tips to interpret data or science you find on the internet, please share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. As always, if you enjoy the evidence-based content, give us a thumbs up, be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.
So we're going to talk about 4 things to look for when you're looking at trials. I'm only 5'6", so no, yeah, I would be a small subject. Okay.
Oh, okay.
You guys put that in there. Now, studies on small samples can be useful and can be hypothesis generating for future studies, but they in and of themselves. Let's try that.
They in and of themselves.
That is not easy to say.
Tip number 4.
Sorry, I just picked my nose.
Oh,
that was pick number 4.